It's no doubt that The Legend of Zelda is home to some of the most interesting and well-designed enemies and weapons in all of gaming. I feel like for as simple as some of the stories and worlds of the Zelda series may be, there's a surprising amount of depth and charm in the places we least expect it. One of my favorite things about Zelda's recurring elements between titles has got to be how the monsters and world itself seem to evolve across each of their respective timelines. Like how one of Zelda's staple enemies, the Octorok, always makes a comeback in each new game, but its appearance and abilities change slightly every time to make it fit in better with the context of the gameplay and world around it. And there's always something kind of funny about the way some enemies like the Lizalfos can go from just another dungeon creep to a whole mini-boss, while others like Mothula do the exact opposite in their later adventures. But really, the Lionel? You mean to tell me this turned into this and we just let that happen? There is so much wrong with these things that it's actually kind of impressive. Where do I even begin? In my first playthrough of Breath of the Wild, after wandering haplessly through the Zoros domain, I remember getting to the part where you're told you have to steal the electric arrows away from something called a Lionel in order to fight the Divine Beast. Having played countless games where get item from enemy equals kill enemy and take drop because gameplay loop go burr, I assumed that I actually had to beat it to get them, instead of the logical choice of not getting one shot over and over again for the good part of 3 hours straight. But do you think that actually stopped me? Yes, after ramming my head into my Pro Controller for quite literally an entire evening, I only somehow managed to beat the Lionel without getting hit once on my first playthrough, only finding out that this was an achievement later when talking about it to my friends, and seeing the look of sheer horror on their faces as I described the video game equivalent of eating a Thai pepper whole for fun, which actually, you know what? I would eat a Thai pepper whole before trying to no-hit the Lionel again, are you kidding me? But at the same time, out of some twisted curiosity, it also made me wonder, what if there was a better way? Of course there was, it's called literally just don't. Okay, but fighting included, could I have just sat back and gone through the Lionel fight the easy way instead? Well, in Breath of the Wild, probably not. I mean, even when you're sneaking around the guy solely focused on picking up the electric arrows, all of his attacks basically one-shot you at the point of the game I was at. Not to mention the absurd amount of health these things have. I swear, I went through like 3 of my best weapons, and I still ended up having to resort to beating the shit out of it with a stick. But in any other Zelda game, it probably could have been a lot easier. And not just because I could fight it with better weapons that wouldn't break, avoid having to learn a frame-perfect combat system with a considerable amount of jank, or even because in previous Zelda games, things like a world boss that could kill you in one hit just wouldn't have existed in the first place. Thanks, open world formula. Every time I find one of these in a game, I can almost immediately tell just by looking at one of them. Like, yeah, that looks like it could probably slice me in half, so why don't I just not get hit? And then after proceeding to get sliced in half for hours and hours upon end, you're always met with seemingly some of the most mundane rewards possible. Like, wow, I beat this massive looking face outside of the starter town with nothing but this little dagger, and I unlock a word. But digressing from my favorite game designer Yoko Taro's near sadistic sense of humor in putting this thing right next to you immediately after starting the game, in all of the history of Zelda, there have been tons and tons of weapons and items like this that could have been perfect for this exact situation. It honestly made me a little disappointed that Breath of the Wild did away with the traditional hookshots and Pegasus boots of the Zelda formula in favor of a more robust, yet sort of plain feeling set of melee weapons instead. But out of all of them, every weapon in Zelda history, all 276 pages of the Hyrule Historia, one weapon has always stood undefeated as the most absolutely broken combat option in the entire series for literally no reason. And you know what? I've got a burning question for you, Nintendo. Why is that weapon, a literal bee, so dang strong? Yep, you heard me right, the bee. This guy right here, in all 8 pixels of his glory, is the objective best weapon to have ever appeared in the Zelda series. And nope, I'm not kidding, the bee is an actual unironic better tool than the Master Sword in every instance of combat you could think of. Look at him, little man is absolutely chuffed. The Master Sword is pretty much the end-all weapon in every Zelda game, no surprise there, considering you normally get it at the end of the game, and it's usually pretty relevant to the plot in one way or another. But looking at it from outside the story and just pure stats alone, the Master Sword is surprisingly pretty weak. Heck, I'd even argue that the Master Sword is one of the weakest weapons in all of Zelda, and here's why. While every Zelda game deals with damage in slightly different ways, generally you can get a good idea for the strength of weapons in relation to the next lowest option by damage value, with the base sword pretty much always starting out at 1 damage, except for in Skyward Sword where it deals half a unit of damage for some reason. In most of the series though, with Breath of the Wild being a complete exception, the Master Sword is twice as strong as the original, which seems pretty impressive when you say it out loud, but a little less so when you realize that's just going from a solid 1 damage to only 2. To show you how stupidly low that is, let's take for instance Zelda Ocarina of Time, where luckily enough, the 2 damage Master Sword rule also applies. You know what else just so happens to do 2 damage in Ocarina of Time? The Deku Stick. A literal stick does the exact same amount of damage as the Master Sword. And not just that, but the Bomb, Bomb Chew, Normal Arrow, Megaton Hammer, and Hook Shot all do this exact same amount as well. And that's not even including the weapons that do more than 2 damage, but I think you get the point. The Master Sword is nothing special, and hey, that's actually okay. I mean, when most normal enemies in Zelda die from just a few hits anyways, you probably won't ever notice it, because damage really doesn't matter all that much. Instead, what matters the most is utility. When almost every option you have to kill something has almost the exact same effect, then really most of the damage itself is kind of negligible at that point. But when a boomerang can take out most of the enemies in a room in an instant, or the bow can keep enemies from even getting close to you, each option has a clear benefit other than pure damage depending on the situation. So really, the question is not what does the most damage, but what is the objective best way to kill a normal enemy in Zelda? And yeah, like I said before, that answer is the B. Originally debuting in A Link to the Past and appearing in most following entries of the series, to the uninformed eye, the bee would look like just another one-and-done enemy that's only really there to make the world feel a little bit more alive. It at least gives some consequence to randomly hitting a tree, adding a little bit of tension to the fact that you might find something other than a rupee or some extra health. Sure, they're a bit of a nuisance since they can show up in groups, but I wouldn't exactly say they're the hardest thing in the world for Link to deal with. So logically, there should be no reason for these guys to have any practical use at all. That is, until you come back to the bees with a bug net and a bottle. Yeah, we're going full bug catcher Joey on these guys. The bug net is a side quest item which you can get from going to Kakariko Village and walking up to this kid who's stuck in the house with a cold, and borrowing it from him. Sure thing, just like how Link borrows rupees from every pot in a 12-mile radius. Let's face it, that net is never coming back. I don't know, the idea that Link, the hero of time, just walks into this kid's house uninvited with a bottle, takes his bug net and just leaves without ever elaborating, 100% forgetting to ever bring it back after he saves Zelda, it's just so in character for some reason. It reminds me that Link is just some random scrimblow who comes from the most nowhere house and village imaginable. Like, he's not morally obligated to do shit, besides the fact that he's the whole chosen one and all, but I'm sure he means well in the end. Well, most of him anyways, but the Zelda manga series is a video for another day. But now, with the bug net in hand, after catching a bee and releasing it in the range of a few enemies, the bee just beats the ever-living shit out of everything on screen, before calling it a day and screwing off before you have to go back and catch another one. Given the fact that you can also catch fairies in a bottle, it makes me imagine the bee is like a really angry fairy in the hypothetical scenario that like Navi or Tottle actually tried to get involved in a fight, and it actually working for some reason. In all fairness against the bee though, despite its relatively high damage to every enemy near Link, it's a pretty temporary solution that wouldn't really be practical to rely on as a main form of damage, if you just wanted to run around and clear every battle without pressing any buttons. Unsurprisingly, all but one boss in the game are completely immune to the bee, which actually makes a lot of sense, considering the whole killing everything with literally zero input from the player thing being just slightly detrimental to balance in the game. The one enemy weak to the bee being Mothula is actually so perfect though, like this demon insect that's like more than twice the size of Link, just getting put through the spin cycle by a 1/10 gram Ubermensch Spartan warrior is just so perfect on so many levels. It would just make it so much better if you could somehow run the whole fight with only the bee as your weapon. Heh. So what if we took the aforementioned god bee, let it snort a line of Cremio's Romani milk, give it 800 odd rupees, and why don't we just for good measure make it immortal, and you have the golden bee from The Legend of Zelda: A Link to the Past. The golden bee, as Zelda Dungeon Wiki puts it, is, quote, a legendary bee that can only be found in 2 places in the game. One of which being inside a fairy fountain in the cave near where the ice rod is found, and the second being as an item sold for 88 rupees in the bottled goods shops in the GBA version, in which the bee will only start to appear after Link shows the shopkeeper said bee from the ice cave. The golden bee is pretty much the exact same as the normal bee, with its one major difference being that it lasts forever. That one little weakness I mentioned earlier that prevents the bee from completely breaking the balance of the game, nope, don't care, didn't ask. Ratio plus no maidens plus god bee. Needless to say, with everything I've mentioned before, the bee's utility, the insignificance of damage as a whole in traditional Zelda games, plus now giving it easy availability with no time limit and in the shop, clearly makes the golden bee in A Link to the Past the most comically broken weapon in all of Zelda. I specify in A Link to the Past because going forward, the later Zelda games were definitely lacking in their arthropod artillery. Okay, look, I'm trying to keep the writing interesting, I really am, but I've already said the word bee 30 times so far, including that one. I swear I'm going to lose it if I have to say that word even one more time. Okay. Going forward, the bee hasn't really had any major utility since A Link to the Past. In most future games, it would go back to just being demoted to another basic enemy to slightly annoy Link in his quest. I mean, in Twilight Princess, I guess you can use them as fishing bait if that counts. Talk about a fall from grace though. At least in Majora's Mask, they're big and menacing, and they're hornets instead of bees, so just their presence alone is enough to scare away the pirates to get the hook shot. The bee's former powers did sort of return once in A Link Between Worlds though, given that it was sort of a pseudo remake of A Link to the Past. But in order to use the bees for combat, you'd have to either randomly find a golden bee in the wild, which is unreliable at best or stupidly rare at worst, or pay 888 rupees to this random dude in a cave, only to later take it to the bee guy who will give you the bee badge in exchange for the bewitching golden bee. I'm going to kill you. By the way, the whole 888 rupees thing is actually pretty freaking clever. You might have noticed the number 8's appeared strangely more than often in regards to bees in A Link to the Past, and that's because it's sort of a pun in Japanese since both the words for the number 8 and for bee are pronounced hachi. It makes it even better that the number 888 already sort of looks like a bee with its wings spread. These guys are on some 8-head level shit. Japanese game devs are just built different. But yeah, with Link Between Worlds bee being a shell of its former glory, I think it's safe to say that the definitive version of the bee remains its first ever iteration from A Link to the Past. Is what I would say if I never played BS Zelda! BS The Legend of Zelda was a niche sub-series of Zelda spin-offs for the Nintendo Satellaview, which was a niche in itself satellite extension for the Super Famicom, which players could use to download various games and content on a set broadcasting schedule. While I did a full video solely dedicated to looking at them before, I'll elaborate a little bit more here since I feel like I didn't really go in depth before as I could now. But hey, you live, you learn. I could always go back and cover them again in a way that actually does them justice, which implies that I'll actually follow through on making a video I somewhat allude to being a future upload. Actually, this is the second time I've said that in this video alone. I need to stop. I've only been back on YouTube for less than one video at this point, and I'm already cursing even more topics in the future video Shadow Realm. Let's go, new record. Anyways, while the first game of the BS Zelda trilogy, nicknamed The Third Quest for its direct continuation of the events and worlds of the first Zelda game, was pretty much just a standard Zelda 1 remake built from the ground up, and the third game was literally just the Japanese version of A Link to the Past, the second game, BS Zelda and the Ancient Stone Tablets, was built using A Link to the Past engine. It featured new dungeons and protagonists, a completely new story, and for all sakes and purposes, was a completely new Zelda game, in the same sense that Majora's Mask and the sequel to Breath of the Wild, if that ends up, you know, tangibly existing, are also quote-unquote completely new Zelda games. But hey, it's the closest thing we'll ever get to a sequel besides Link Between Worlds, so I'll take it. What makes the Ancient Stone Tablet special though is the glaring absence of Link, in favor of the two Satellaview avatars, one of which would represent the player based on their gender they selected when using the service, who also just so happen to lack any sword whatsoever upon starting the game. At this point, you might be asking, but Flashcap, if there's no sword, how are we supposed to play the game? Oh god, it's the bee, isn't it? Just to rub salt in the wound of how useless the bee makes normal combat, the starting weapon in the game just skips the sword altogether. I love how just to make you actually have a reason to use a sword and like play the game, the bee just straight up leaves as soon as you get one because the glint from the blade is like annoying for it or something. So for that small reason, it's still nowhere near as broken as the legendary Link to the Past bee, but I felt like its appearance in this game is often overlooked given just how big of a role it plays. So I still wanted to mention it here anyways. Then again, we're talking about a game that could only be played for a certain amount of time over the span of a few weeks for a hardware extension that was only ever sold in Japan via mail order. This thing was doomed to obscurity no matter how you slice it. But hey, it's got a freaking god bee in it, that's good enough for me. Plus, against the Lionel, I would gladly take even the lesser bee over fighting that thing again with a broom. That's not necessarily to say the new approaches to combat Breath of the Wild offers are inherently bad or lackluster. I've seen my fair share of the insane 1200 APM instant kill combos from Japanese Zelda Twitter, enough so to admit that if you know what you're doing, you can pull off some serious good by just working with the quirks and more sandboxy nature of the game's physics engine. That being said though, there's just something that feels so much more interesting to me about the way combat devoid of complex damage values, where just unlocking a new smarter way to fight tangibly changes how you approach future scenarios. It just feels so much more satisfying in comparison to the sporadic bursts of progression that come from Breath of the Wild shrines. I think it's that sense of discovery unique to Zelda where each new item or song feels like finding another piece to one big puzzle that encompasses the whole game is what I felt was missing the most while playing Breath of the Wild. I remember finding out just how insanely busted the gold bee really was after my friend Chris, the mayor of Smashville, told me what it could do in class one day after watching my clickbait as hell top 5 worst Zelda items of all time video, where I wrongfully dissed the bee after like 2 seconds of research. Just hearing that there was a secret overpowered bee weapon hidden in some random cave by word of mouth was enough to get me interested. Heck, it's that one anecdote alone which is the entire reason I'm even making this video in the first place. I think that just goes to show that items, and really all of the puzzle-like discoveries that built on top of one another in the Zelda formula of old, had a lot more weight to them than what we got later. Like, sure, the same idea is still mostly there, but it's definitely no secret ice cave which requires a seemingly unrelated side quest after a somewhat convoluted series of events to unlock a rumored invincible pet bee. Okay, I'm being way too harsh on Breath of the Wild. I mean, I still have yet to actually beat that game, so my opinion could totally change later. And besides, like 60% of what I feel for the bee in particular is probably doused in a little more nostalgia than I'd like to admit. Whether it be the golden bee or the hookshot though, I could talk all day about how my favorite Zelda puzzles and dungeons use the respective items in the most galaxy brain ways imaginable, but this video is already long enough as is. If there's anything you take away from all this though, it's that at the end of the day, no matter what weapon or item is your favorite, or even whether or not it's in the nature of open world games to dial back on some level of impact in discovering their secrets, I think that even the smallest detail in a game is worth looking at with some nuance for the sake of curiosity alone. I mean, someone had to put it there for a reason, right? I just happen to be the one creature genuinely unhinged enough to spend that nuance analyzing why a literal 8-pixel wide bee is so fundamentally broken in the greater context of its game series that it's unironically hilarious to me. And just for the record, that's like the only positive thing you'll ever hear me say about the collective bloodline of wasps and hornets in the middle of summer. I can't even sit outside and touch grass with these things. Whoever thought this was balanced game design needs to be shot. But bumblebees though, you guys are chillin'. Keep pollinating and stuff, helping the environment, you know, removing my enemies from this plane of existence and all. Stay awesome. I don't really know how to end this video, so if you got this far, just thanks for being here and listening to me ramble about Zelda bee weapons and game design for the good part of half an hour. If you're a new viewer, for context, it's been close to a year since I last uploaded a video to this channel. I didn't really know what type of video I wanted to come back to YouTube with because for the longest time it felt like after such an extended absence, there was always some unseen pressure for me to make my returning video better than all of the ones before it, as if to excuse being gone for so long with relatively little communication by making up for it with something the quality of which would reflect the time it took for me to return in the first place. But I felt like despite just how niche and random a topic something like this is, I wanted to make this video just because it's something that I enjoyed thinking about writing, which might not seem like that big a reason for me to choose it over the other, admittedly more interesting things I plan to make later, but it's for the very reason that I already genuinely enjoyed working on it alone that made it that much more special to me, considering how long it's been since I felt like I was making something that had personal value to me and the contrast of appealing to some inner ethos about my channel fitting a certain genre or archetype. Sort of in the same way that the simplicity of a bee just wrecking everything on screen in comparison to the absolute batshit insane depth of complexity in its combat system's successor is still just as, if not more entertaining for a reason I can't put into more words than this video is already encompassed. It's been an absolute blast so far, and I hope you enjoyed this video as much as I did. Okay, it's like 4 AM as I'm finishing this, I need some sleep. TLDR, bees are rad, making this video has been rad, therefore, this video is bees. Thanks for watching. Hey guys, outro flash here. I just wanted to mention that I'm experimenting a lot with how I go about vocal delivery for future videos, and I didn't notice it until editing, but if you couldn't tell before, my Wave 3 picks up a lot of the higher registers of my voice. It was kind of a normal thing for me to exaggerate my cadence in a lot of my older videos, both for stylistic effect and just because I didn't really like how grating my old mic made my more relaxed voice sound. And while I really like the new slower pacing I took with this video, my new mic doesn't really have that old problem, and I think my voice came across a little higher in some areas than I'd like. So going forward, expect a bit less of a dynamic cadence since it's closer to my normal talking voice in English. I didn't want to re-record this entire video though because the original recording session took like 3 hours, and it wasn't as big an issue as I think most people would even really notice. I just wanted to mention that if I sound a little more dead inside or cynical in my newer uploads, that it's a lot closer to how I actually sound. So make of that what you will. Anyway, just wanted to throw that out there. Thanks for watching again, and I will see you guys in the next video. Hopefully coming soon. Bye bye.